Most people believe they know how the Great Depression began. They tend to picture one dramatic day, October 29, 1929, when the stock market collapsed. Panic swept through Wall Street, and the American dream came crashing down. It's a clean story with a clear villain, the reckless speculator gambling on margin, and a clear turning point, the ticker tape spitting out catastrophe in real time. But here is the problem. That story is dangerously incomplete and, in several respects, simply wrong. The 1929 stock market crash was not, by itself, the cause of the Great Depression. Let me say that again because it matters. The crash was a symptom rather than the underlying disease. It was a tremor that rattled the windows. But the real structural damage, the rot eating away at the foundation of the global economy, had been accumulating for over a decade before a single share price collapsed. What actually caused the worst economic disaster in modern history is a far darker, more complicated, and more human story than you've been taught. It involves decisions made in secret boardrooms in Paris and Washington, a dead central banker whose absence changed the fate of nations, a gold fetish that strangled the world's money supply, a trade war that made enemies out of allies, and a level of wealth inequality so extreme that the entire consumer economy was standing on a trapdoor. The Great Depression was not simply an accident. It was engineered, piece by institutions and individuals who believed they were doing the right thing. And the most unsettling part is that many of the same mistakes are being repeated today. So let us go back, not merely to 1929, but considerably further, because the true origin of the Great Depression doesn't start on Wall Street. Its deeper origins lead us to the mud and trenches of the Western Front. When the guns of the First World War finally fell silent in November of 1918, Europe was a shattered continent. France had lost nearly 1.4 million soldiers. Britain had buried close to 900,000. Germany's losses exceeded 2 million. The economic destruction was equally staggering. Roads, bridges, railways, and factories across Belgium, northern France, and Eastern Europe had been bombed into rubble. The old empires, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, were dissolving, and the financial system that had held the industrialized world together for decades, the classical gold standard, had been effectively suspended during the war because governments needed to print money to fund their militaries. Now, here's the critical thing that most historians gloss over when they discuss the Depression. Before the war, the global economy had been remarkably interconnected. Capital flowed freely across borders. Trade moved with relatively few restrictions. Currencies were pegged to gold, and that peg created a kind of automatic balancing mechanism. If a country imported more than it exported, gold would flow out. That outflow would tighten the domestic money supply, lower prices, make exports more competitive, and eventually gold would flow back. It was elegant in theory, and for decades it more or less worked. The war, however, shattered that equilibrium, and what followed was not a restoration of the old order, but a deeply flawed attempt to rebuild it, one that planted the seeds of the catastrophe to come. Herbert Hoover, years later, wrote in his memoirs that the primary cause of the Great Depression was the War of 1914 to 1918. And while Hoover got many things wrong during his presidency, on this point, he was arguably more right than he has ever been given credit for. The 1919 Treaty of Versailles imposed severe reparations on Germany. The total amount demanded was staggering, 132 billion gold marks, an amount that many economists at the time, including John Maynard Keynes, warned was economically impossible to collect. But France, devastated by the war and burdened by its own debts to Britain and the United States, needed that money desperately. Britain, in turn, owed substantial war debts to America, which had emerged from the conflict not only unscathed but as the world's largest creditor nation for the first time. The result was a dangerously fragile international circulation of debt. Germany was supposed to pay reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain were supposed to use some of that money to repay their war debts to the United States. And the United States, flush with gold and industrial power, was supposed to lend money back to Germany so Germany could make its reparation payments. It was a loop, a fragile, politically explosive loop, and it required every link in the chain to hold. If any single country faltered, defaulted, or stopped lending, the entire system would seize up. And yet, this is precisely the arrangement that the victorious powers chose to build, not because it represented sound economics, but because it was politically convenient. American politicians didn't want to forgive Allied war debts because voters would have viewed it as a giveaway. French politicians couldn't abandon reparations because their electorate demanded that Germany pay for the destruction, and so the world's most powerful nations locked themselves into a financial structure that was, from the very beginning, a financial house of cards. Now, overlaying this debt problem was the question of the gold standard. Before the war, most industrialized nations had linked their currencies to gold. During the conflict, they had abandoned those links to finance their war spending. After the armistice, there was an almost religious conviction among central bankers and finance ministers that the world needed to return to gold. The gold standard represented stability, credibility, discipline. It was seen as the backbone of civilization itself. But returning to gold after the war was nothing like maintaining it before the war. The war had radically redistributed the world's monetary gold. By the mid-1920s, the United States held nearly 45% of the world's monetary gold. France, after stabilizing its currency at a deliberately undervalued rate in 1926, began accumulating gold at an astonishing pace. Between 1927 and 1932, France's share of world gold reserves surged from 7% to 27%. Together, the United States and France were hoarding the majority of the world's monetary gold, and this created an almost impossible situation for every other country trying to maintain their gold standard commitments. Here is where the story gets deeply strange, and where most conventional histories of the Depression miss the mark entirely. The Bank of France, under the influence of a rigid gold standard orthodoxy, was actively sterilizing its gold inflows. In plain language, that means France was absorbing enormous quantities of gold from the rest of the world, but refusing to expand its money supply in proportion. Under the rules of the gold standard game, when gold flows into a country, that country is supposed to print more money, which raises domestic prices, makes its exports less competitive, and eventually reverses the gold flow. In theory, the mechanism is supposed to correct itself. France, however, did not allow that mechanism to operate normally. It hoarded the gold and kept its money supply tight. The consequences were severe. An NBAR working paper by economist Douglas Irwin argues that France was, in many respects, more responsible for the worldwide deflation of 1929 to 1933 than the United States was. His counterfactual simulations suggest that if central banks had simply maintained their 1928 gold reserve ratios, world prices would have actually increased slightly during this period instead of collapsing catastrophically. In other words, the deflation was not necessarily inevitable. It was a policy choice made by central bankers in Washington and Paris, who clung to an outdated monetary doctrine with almost theological conviction. And France was not alone in this rigidity. Switzerland, Belgium, and the Netherlands, all members of what historians call the Gold Bloc, pursued similarly tight monetary policies. The gold standard, which was supposed to be a stabilizing force, had become what Keynes famously called a curse laid upon the economic life of the world. It functioned not as a safety net, but as a transmission belt, spreading contractionary shocks from one country to the next in a relentless mechanical cascade. Now, if there was one person who might have been able to prevent this cascade, or at least soften its impact, it was a man named Benjamin Strong. And his death in October of 1928, just 12 months before the crash, may have been one of the single most consequential events leading to the Depression. Strong had been the governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York since its founding in 1914, And he was, by almost any measure, the most powerful central banker in the world. He was a forceful personality with deep connections to international finance. He maintained a close working relationship with Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, and he understood better than almost anyone alive the fragility of the interwar monetary system. Economists Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, in their landmark work A Monetary History of the United States, argued that Strong's death fundamentally altered the balance of power within the Federal Reserve System and left it without effective leadership at precisely the moment when decisive action was most needed. While Strong was alive, the New York Fed had been the dominant force in American monetary policy. Strong had pushed for coordination with European central banks. He had championed open market operations as a tool for stabilizing the economy. He had, in 1927, cut the Fed's discount rate to help ease pressure on the Bank of England and keep the international gold standard from collapsing. That rate cut was controversial, and critics like Herbert Hoover later blamed it for fueling stock market speculation. But Strong believed that maintaining international monetary cooperation was more important than policing Wall Street's excesses. When Strong died, the power within the Federal Reserve shifted away from the New York Bank and toward the board in Washington and the regional reserve banks, many of which were led by men with far less sophistication about international finance and far more rigid views about monetary orthodoxy. The decision-making that had been relatively centralized under Strong became fragmented and indecisive. At precisely the worst moment, the Fed became divided and increasingly indecisive. The economist Charles Kindleberger went further, stating flatly that if Strong had not died in 1928, the Great Depression might have been avoided entirely, or at least would have been far less severe. That's a breathtaking claim for a single individual, but it speaks to just how much the disaster hinged on institutional failures and the absence of competent leadership at the critical moment. Now let's move to the late 1920s, to the period that most people think of as the Roaring Good Times. And there was genuine prosperity in the United States during the 1920s. Industrial production was booming. New consumer products, automobiles, radios, refrigerators were transforming daily life. The stock market was soaring, but beneath that glittering surface, the American economy had a structural problem that almost nobody in power was willing to acknowledge. The prosperity was distributed extremely unevenly. By 1929, the top 1% of American families received nearly 24% of all pre-tax income. The top 0.1% earned roughly the same amount as the entire bottom 42% combined. Meanwhile, approximately 80% of American families had no savings at all. Wages for factory workers, miners, and farmers had stagnated throughout the decade, even as corporate profits and stock prices climbed relentlessly higher. This was not merely a moral issue. It was also a structural economic time bomb. A mass industrial economy ultimately depends on consumption. People need to buy things: cars, clothes, appliances, food. When the vast majority of the population barely earns enough to cover basic necessities, the economy becomes dangerously top-heavy. The wealthy few can only buy so many refrigerators. They can only eat so many meals. Their consumption, no matter how lavish, cannot sustain an industrial economy designed to produce goods for millions. The economist John Kenneth Galbraith identified this unequal distribution of income as one of the 5 fundamental weaknesses of the American economy heading into the Depression. And he listed it first, not the stock market, not the banks, the income gap. Because when you have an economy where most people can't afford to buy what the economy is producing, you inevitably get overproduction and underconsumption. Inventories pile up. Factories cut back. Workers lose hours, then lose jobs. Spending falls further, and the downward spiral begins feeding on itself. The wealthy, for their part, weren't spending their surplus income on consumer goods. They were pouring it into financial speculation, into stocks, into real estate, into the very asset bubbles that would eventually pop. And many middle-class Americans, desperate to keep up with the image of prosperity they saw around them, were borrowing to spend. Consumer credit was expanding rapidly during the 20s. Installment buying became widespread, and household debt was climbing even as household income growth stalled. This is a pattern that should feel uncomfortably familiar to anyone who lived through 2008. So, when the stock market began to wobble in the autumn of 1929, it didn't fall into a vacuum. It fell into an economy that was already cooling off, already weakened by inequality, already stretched thin by debt, and already being strangled by a monetary system that was draining liquidity from the global financial system. The crash provided the spark, but the economic structure was already dangerously combustible. And here's the thing about the crash itself. It did not necessarily have to become a catastrophe of historic proportions. Stock market crashes had happened before. There was a sharp panic in 1907 that J.P. Morgan personally helped stabilize. There was a significant recession in 1920 and 1921 that the economy recovered from relatively quickly. What made 1929 different was less the crash itself than the disastrous policy response that followed it. When the banking system began to buckle in the fall of 1930, when the first wave of bank failures swept through the country, the Federal Reserve, now leaderless and divided after Strong's death, did almost nothing. It did not flood the system with liquidity. It did not act as a lender of last resort, which was, ironically, the very purpose for which it had been created in 1913. Instead, the Fed largely stood aside while bank after bank collapsed, destroying the savings of millions of ordinary Americans and draining the money supply at a terrifying rate. Between 1929 and 1933, the money supply in the United States fell by approximately 33%. 1/5 of all commercial banks closed permanently. Real income dropped by 36%. And the Federal Reserve, the institution created specifically to prevent this kind of disaster, actually made things worse. In 1931, with the economy already in freefall, the Fed raised the discount rate from 1.5% to 3.5%. It tightened monetary conditions in the middle of an already severe deflationary collapse. The reasoning was that the rate hike was necessary to defend the gold standard and stem the outflow of gold from the United States. In other words, the Fed chose to protect an abstraction, the gold parity of the dollar, over the livelihoods of millions of Americans. Ben Bernanke, who would later chair the Federal Reserve during the financial crisis of 2008, gave a now famous speech at a conference honoring Milton Friedman in 2002. Addressing Friedman directly, Bernanke said regarding the Great Depression, "You're right. We did it. We're very sorry. But thanks to you, we won't do it again." It was as close to an institutional confession as a central bank has ever come. But the Federal Reserve's failures, as monumental as they were, don't fully explain why a recession turned into a depression that lasted a decade and engulfed the world. For that, you need to look at another catastrophic policy blunder, one that came not from the central bank, but from the halls of Congress. In June of 1930, President Herbert Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act into law, raising tariffs on more than 20,000 imported goods to some of the highest levels in American history. Its stated purpose was to shield American farmers and manufacturers from foreign competition during the downturn. More than 1,000 economists signed a petition urging Hoover not to sign the bill. He signed it anyway. The international response was immediate and severe. Canada, America's largest trading partner, immediately imposed retaliatory on 16 categories of American goods, covering roughly 30% of all U.S. exports to Canada. Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and dozens of other countries followed suit with their own tariff walls. Within 2 years, more than 24 nations had enacted retaliatory trade barriers. Global trade, which had been the lifeblood of the interconnected world economy, collapsed by approximately 66% between 1929 and 1934. The impact on American industry was devastating. U.S. exports to Europe plummeted from roughly $2.3 billion in 1929 to just $784 million in 1932. Imports from Europe dropped even more sharply from 1.3 billion to 390 million. For industries that depended on foreign markets, particularly agriculture and heavy manufacturing, the tariff was a "remember that loop I described earlier?" Germany borrowing from America to pay reparations to France, and Britain, who in turn paid war debts to America. Smoot-Hawley blew that loop apart. If Germany couldn't sell goods to America because of tariffs, it couldn't earn the dollars it needed to service its debts. If American lending to Germany dried up, as it had been doing since 1928 when the Fed raised interest rates, the entire reparations system collapsed, and collapse it did. In 1931, the Kreditanstalt, Austria's largest bank, failed. The contagion spread to Germany, where a full-blown banking crisis erupted. Britain, unable to defend the pound, abandoned the gold standard in September of 1931. One financial domino fell after another. Now let us bring these different threads together, because the true horror of the Great Depression is not any single cause, but the way multiple failures reinforced each other in a death spiral that no single policy change could have stopped. You had the unresolved legacy of the First World War, a global debt structure that was inherently unstable and politically impossible to reform. You had the gold standard rigidly reimposed on a world that could no longer sustain it, concentrating monetary gold in the vaults of the United States and France while the rest of the world starved for liquidity. You had the death of Benjamin Strong, which robbed the Federal Reserve of its most capable leader at the moment when leadership mattered most. You had a Federal Reserve that, in the absence of Strong's guidance, pursued disastrously tight monetary policy, allowing the money supply to collapse and refusing to act as a lender of last resort during successive waves of bank failures. You had extreme income inequality that hollowed consumer demand and made the economy structurally vulnerable to any downturn. You had reckless financial speculation fueled by cheap credit and inadequate regulation that inflated asset bubbles which were bound to burst. And you had Smoot-Hawley, which demolished international trade and cooperation at precisely the moment when the world needed them most. Any one of these factors could have produced a serious downturn. Together, they combined into a catastrophe that destroyed the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people across the globe. Industrial production in the United States fell by nearly 47%. GDP declined by 30%, unemployment exceeded 20%, and in some cities it reached 50% or higher. People lost homes, savings, jobs, and often their sense of dignity. Families that had been middle class a year earlier were standing in breadlines. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is how much of the disaster was preventable. The gold standard didn't have to be reimposed so rigidly. The Bank of France didn't have to hoard gold. The Federal Reserve didn't have to let banks fail. Congress didn't have to pass Smoot-Hawley. Governments didn't have to prioritize an abstract commitment to gold parity over the welfare of their citizens. These were decisions made by real people inside real institutions, often with the best of intentions. And they produced the worst economic disaster in modern history. What historians get wrong time and again is reducing this complexity to a simple narrative. The stock market crashed and then the Depression happened. That framing is more than incomplete. It can be actively misleading. It implies that the Depression was a natural disaster, an act of God, something that descended on the world without warning. But the Depression was not an unavoidable natural disaster. It was manufactured by policy failures at every level, by central bankers who worshipped gold, by politicians who chose protectionism over cooperation, by financial system that concentrated wealth in fewer and fewer hands, and by institutions that failed to act when action could have made the difference. And the deeper you look, the more uncomfortable the parallels become with our own time. Rising wealth inequality, polarized politics, central banks struggling with the limits of their tools, trade wars and tariff escalation, a global financial system built on enormous and potentially unsustainable debt, an international order that seems to be fraying at the edges with cooperation giving way to nationalism and competition. The Great Depression forced the world to learn some extremely painful lessons. Lessons that led to the creation of institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, deposit insurance, and modern central banking practices. But historical lessons have a tendency to fade with time. The generation that lived through the Depression, that stood in breadlines and watched banks close and lost everything, is gone now, and the institutional safeguards they built are being questioned, weakened, or dismantled. The Great Depression was neither a single event nor the product of a single cause. It was a systemic breakdown, a cascade of errors and miscalculations that fed on each other until the entire global economy collapsed under their weight. And the most dangerous myth of all is that it could never happen again. Now, there is one more dimension to this story that rarely gets discussed, and that is the human cost beyond the statistics. When we talk about unemployment reaching 25%, we're talking about roughly 13 million Americans who had no work, no income, and in many cases, no prospects. But statistics alone cannot capture what living through the Depression actually felt like. They don't capture the father who walked out of his house every morning pretending to go to a job that no longer existed because he couldn't face telling his family the truth. They don't capture the children who went to school hungry because there was simply nothing in the kitchen. They don't capture the shame, the despair, the quiet erosion of human dignity that came with years of poverty in the richest nation on earth. In the rural South and the Great Plains, the Depression collided with environmental disaster. The Dust Bowl, a decade-long ecological catastrophe caused by decades of aggressive farming practices and a prolonged drought, turned millions of acres of once productive farmland into desert. Massive dust storms, some stretching hundreds of miles across, darkened the skies of cities as far east as New York and Washington. Hundreds of thousands of families, their land ruined and their livelihoods destroyed, packed what they could into battered trucks and headed west to California, where they were met not with open arms, but with hostility, exploitation, and misery. The psychological cost was enormous. Suicide rates climbed significantly during the early 1930s. Malnutrition was widespread, particularly among children. In some coal mining regions of Appalachia and industrial cities of the Midwest, conditions approached those of the developing world. People were dying not from exotic diseases, but from the simple grinding consequences of poverty, from hunger, from cold, from treatable illnesses they could no longer afford to have treated. And here's the thing that should keep us up at night. The Depression destroyed more than wealth. It also shattered faith. Faith in institutions, faith in democracy, faith in the idea that the system could work for ordinary people. And into that vacuum of faith stepped some of the most dangerous political movements of the 20th century. In Germany, the Depression's devastation fueled the rise of the Nazi Party. In Italy, it strengthened Mussolini's grip on power. In Japan, it empowered the militarists who would lead the country into imperial expansion across Asia. The road from the trading floors of Wall Street to the battlefields of the Second World War runs directly through the economic catastrophe of the 1930s. That connection is not incidental. It is causal. Economic desperation can become fertile ground for political extremism. When people lose everything, when the social contract feels broken, when the institutions that are supposed to protect them have obviously failed, they become susceptible to demagogues who offer simple answers to complex problems. Blame the foreigners. Snorts. Blame the bankers. Blame the other. The specific scapegoats change from country to country and era to era, but the underlying dynamic remains the same. This is why understanding the true causes of the Great Depression matters so much, not just as an exercise in historical scholarship, but as a warning, because the forces that produced the Depression, extreme inequality, rigid monetary dogma, trade protectionism, institutional incompetence, international debt imbalances, political short-sightedness, these forces are not merely relics of a distant era. They are present with us right now in different forms and different proportions, but recognizable to anyone willing to look. The conventional story of the Great Depression is a comforting one in a way. It tells us that a market went crazy, a bubble popped, and things got bad for a while. It implies that the Depression was essentially an accident, a freak event that we've since learned to prevent. The deeper story is considerably less reassuring. The real story is that the Depression was caused by systemic failures in institutions that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of disaster. Central banks that tightened when they should have eased, governments that raised barriers when they should have cooperated, financial systems that concentrated risk and wealth in dangerous ways, an international order that prioritized rigid adherence to outdated rules over the welfare of hundreds of millions of people. And the most sobering lesson of all is this: almost everyone who made these disastrous decisions believed they were doing the right thing. The central bankers who defended the gold standard believed they were maintaining financial discipline. The politicians who passed Smoot-Hawley believed they were protecting American workers. The Federal Reserve governors who refused to intervene during the bank panics believed they were allowing the market to correct itself naturally. They were not necessarily evil. They were disastrously wrong. And the difference between a recession and a depression, between hardship and catastrophe, came down to whether the people in charge understood what was actually happening and had the courage to act. That is one of the central lessons of the Great Depression. Not that markets crash. Markets have always crashed and always will. The lesson is that what matters most is what happens next, what the people in power choose to do in the aftermath, and whether they have the wisdom and the will to break with orthodoxy when orthodoxy is leading the world off a cliff. So the next time someone tells you that the Great Depression was caused by the stock market crash, you'll know better. You'll know that the crash was just the beginning, the moment when a decade of accumulated failures finally became impossible to ignore. Its deeper causes were older, more structural, and far more human than any stock ticker could ever reveal. They were rooted in war, in debt, in gold, in greed, in fear, and in the fatal assumption that the rules of the past could govern the future. And those causes, in one form or another, are still with us. If this story changed the way you look at economic history, take a moment and hit that subscribe button. We go deep on the forces that actually move markets, nations, and the global order. It's the kind of stories that don't make the evening news, but quietly shape the world you live in. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on which factor you think was the most critical cause of the Depression. Was it the gold standard, the Fed, inequality? I'd love to hear your take. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video. It genuinely helps the channel reach more people who care about understanding how money and power actually work. I will see you in the next video.